Hi everyone, welcome back. This week, as you can see, I'm still in America and I am going to be doing a Napoleonic figure for you this time because it's been a little while, and I think after World War II, Napoleonics are kind of the most requested figures. It's kind of the most requested period that I get, and so yeah, I try to do quite a few of them. However, I've kind of been a little off balance because most of the Napoleonics I've done so far, actually I think all of them, except maybe one, have been French, which is actually not very representative because there were obviously a lot more countries involved, and, just so painting the French is not, they're fun to paint because they have pretty uniforms, but there are a lot of other guys. So what I've got for you this week is your sort of standard British line infantry. This is actually a sergeant here, so he's a little bit more fancy than just a plain, run-of-the-mill soldier, but his uniform's very similar. This particular model is by Wargames Foundry, so you can see I've already prepped him, and he's got his sort of sergeant's staff there. I thought doing the English here would be a good choice because I'm sure that aside from French armies, British armies are probably one of the most popular that people are going to be playing from this time period. And I've definitely had some requests for Napoleonic Brits, how you do their uniform. And so that's what I'm going to be showing you today. This is a fairly basic one, and depending on how it all goes, I may be showing you some more specialist units. I definitely got some other Napoleonic armies that I want to be showing you, some Austrians, some Russians, some things like that. But I'm going to start with the Brits because, they're kind of one of the most famous Napoleonic opponents that you've got. So this uniform, obviously red and white, with some interesting piping going on. Since pretty recently I did some white pants. See my French Legionnaire figure from, several videos ago. I won't be doing white pants on this guy. I'm going to be giving him gray pants, which was something that was also pretty common on the Napoleonic Brits. They had white pants, but sometimes they also had sort of a more medium gray color, and as a break, I'm going to be showing you that. And of course, for people who hate painting white or don't want to put the time in because it is time consuming, gray is a faster and easier color to do. So that's what we'll be doing on this particular fellow right here. So yeah, I think that's pretty much everything. So I am going to go ahead and get started with my British Napoleonic sergeant figure. Alright, I'm going to start out by painting his pants, and as I said earlier, I decided to go for the gray variant on the pants here. It's probably a little easier if you're not a fan of doing white. My base coat here is a mixture of Vallejo neutral gray and just a hint of red. You can really use any shade of red you want because you're going to be putting such a tiny amount, it won't really matter, but it gives the gray sort of a nice cast, and it will also go well with the red jacket we're going to be painting in later. So just apply that all over the pants and also onto his bedroll, which would have been a sort of similar color. Next, I'm going to apply a wash of Nuln oil to all of the gray areas. This doesn't have to be a particularly heavy wash. Just make sure it's nice and uniform and you don't have too much pooling going on. But this will just help get a little extra contrast down in all of the folds and creases. Once the wash is dry, I'm going to start highlighting. And the highlighting process is going to be similar to what I usually do. My first highlight here is going to be the neutral gray again with just a little bit of that red still in it, and I've just lightened it ever so slightly with white. And I'm keeping it reasonably thin here, and I'm going to just start applying it gradually to all of the areas where light is hitting. As always with this first layer, you can feel free to apply it at least thinly pretty much everywhere on the model, and then as we go along we'll be sort of gradually cutting back the areas where we're applying paint. These pants also have some seams and creases in them that you want to definitely be sure you leave dark because that'll just make the pants look nicer if you keep those dark seam details in there. And of course, don't forget to paint the bedroll every time you're applying a new layer of gray paint. I'm just going to continue the highlighting process by adding more and more white into the color mix I already started. So my first highlight that I just showed had not too much white in it, and now I'm going to move on and add in quite a bit more, and I'm going to start focusing more and more on the areas where I expect light to be hitting and on those sharp creases. And I'm going to be if the crease is not super sharp and clean, if it sort of smooths out into just flat fabric, then I'll sort of blend it outwards so that there's no real sharp harsh definition between those two areas. And you can really just continue this process of gradually lightening the highlight color as much as you want, making really, really subtle steps if you want. And if you do that, it will take you longer, but it will be easier to get a blended appearance without having to do lots of feathering or, sort of having to do actual physical work with your brush, because the color gradation will be so subtle that it'll just sort of blend by itself. But you kind of have to sort of find your sweet spot when you're doing this, the right sort of number of highlights for you that will give you enough different levels of contrast, but will not require at the same time for you to apply too many layers of paint here. So I've now applied 3 highlight levels over my base, and that's usual for me. I tend to apply about 3 levels, and then I will then usually apply one final highlight stage, which is for doing sort of really sharp edges and really accenting seams and things like that. But it really is going to depend on what color you're working with. I find that some colors need more different highlight levels than others, and then some you can get away with just 2. So this is about playing around, and just working out the right sort of spot for you, depending on how you like to paint. You do your final highlight, your really edge highlight, which is sort of my 4th highlight, as I said, should be very, very light. It's so light, in fact, usually that if you tried to apply it too heavily, it would not look good. So this color I always apply quite thinned down and very subtly. I don't go back over it to build up color. I just kind of use it really as an edge highlight and to accent seams and stuff like that, and just maybe very subtly on knees and stuff. And that's what I'm doing here. And this color, it's the same process I've been following, lightening up that neutral gray. I keep making sure I leave a little bit of red in the mix, so if it gets too gray, I add in a little more red. But this final highlight here really has quite a lot of white in it. It's a very light color, but I'm using a very gentle touch and applying it right now to the model. With the pants and bedroll done, I'm going to be moving on to the coat, and of course, this being a Napoleonic British soldier, he's got his famous red jacket on. I'm following the same procedure I usually use for red here, which is to base coat everything with Vallejo black red, and I'm going to highlight from there. Don't forget that besides the jacket, if you're painting a sergeant figure like this one, he's going to have a sash on, which is also going to be red. So yeah, just make sure that you get that painted up as well. My red here was a little transparent, so I had to go back in and apply a couple layers. That's probably just because I didn't mix it quite well enough. And my next step is to take some Citadel Mephiston red and start layering that on all the red areas. Now, this is a base color from Citadel, which means it's a thicker, heavier paint with better sort of coverage than their layer paints have. So if you want to apply it in this fashion, sort of layering on, and you want to get some more different tones, I recommend that you thin it down just a little bit. So I'm just going to be applying this now. I'm going to be going back over and over the figure, sort of gradually building it up and applying more heavier layers and more layers on those areas where there would be light hitting, and sort of ignoring the areas that are more in the recesses. I didn't mention the last step, but the plume on top of his hat has a red stripe or a red piece on it, so make sure that you also paint that red while you're doing this. So yeah, this is just a case of applying sort of gradual increasing layers. My experience actually painting these guys is that they tend to have so many pieces of equipment, so many straps and things. The actual amount of red that you're actually going to be painting that's actually exposed is probably going to be minimal, which I actually think is a shame, because I enjoy painting red and I think it's one of the easier colors to do, providing of course that you have the right paints. And now I'm going to continue highlighting the red, and I'm using Citadel Evil Sun Scarlet for that, and that is one of their layer colors. It's quite a bright red, and it's relatively thin out of the bottle, so it doesn't require any extra thinning, but I'm just going to be continuing going back over the red areas and applying this really now only to areas where I expect there to be a lot of light hitting and where the uniform is going to be very bright, kind of blending it out a little bit into those sort of darker shaded areas. But definitely you want this color in here because it's quite a nice brilliant red, and it's quite transparent, but when it's applied over these sort of deeper shades of red, it really creates a beautiful, rich, warm, nuanced shade. And you need it really because these Napoleonic sort of uniforms that the Brits wore were quite bright red, and if you don't sort of apply this really bright red, you're not going to get enough brilliance of color, at least not in my opinion. It's certainly not at this scale, because you often at this scale, as I've said before, want to sort of exaggerate colors or make them brighter or lighter than you might at full scale, just so that you can get the sort of right amount of impact out of what you're doing. Now I'm going to start working on his facing color, which is what is on the soldier's cuffs, his collar, and in the case of the sergeant, he's also going to have a stripe of this color down the middle of his sash. Now, this color is obviously going to vary for you depending on the regiment that you're painting. I'm going with green here because I like how that looks with the red in this case. It's a very common facing color, but you know, you're going to have to sort of just figure out what you're painting and use that as a guide. This color here is German extra dark green from Vallejo, and I'm going to be using that here to just carefully base coat all those areas. It takes a little bit of freehand work to put the stripe down the middle of the sash, so be a little bit careful when you're doing that. Because these green areas are pretty small and straightforward, you shouldn't need to put too much effort into highlighting them, especially since there's some lacing on top of them that's going to obscure the green anyway, but you do want to do a little. I have made a first highlight here by mixing Vallejo medium green with the German extra dark green that I already had, and that's going to sort of be my first green highlight. Once I'm satisfied with that, and it shouldn't really take you too long to apply that, you can then go on and continue highlighting using just pure sort of medium green here. And I found, at least in my experience, that this medium green color was a kind of transparent, so you might find yourself needing to layer it a couple of times to get enough brightness in areas where you really want light hitting. And if that's not enough, you can then go ahead and just mix a little bit of white into that green. Not too much, or it'll get too pale and washed out, but you can add just a little bit and use that sort of as the final color, especially maybe as an edge highlight on his cuffs or collar. But that'll have to, you know, really depend on, you know, what you think looks good. Next, I'm going to work on the sort of black and gray areas on this figure, which is mostly sort of leather areas, but also his hat, which I believe was sort of sometimes leather, or maybe covered in sort of a black fabric, but in any case, it's sort of the same base. So I'm going to be just taking some black paint here, and I'm going to use it to base coat his boots, his scabbard for his sword, because he's a sergeant, he seems to have a sword, his backpack here, which would have been sort of a blackish gray color, and also, of course, his hat. I'm then going to start highlighting the black-gray areas, and I'm going to first apply German gray, and you can put this on pretty generously. It's a pretty sort of overall color. You really only just want to not put it down in really deep shadows, or sort of where there's sort of deep creases or folds, or sort of the dividing lines between different pieces of, you know, fabric or whatever. You want to leave those black, but otherwise you can go ahead and put the German gray everywhere else. I've now mixed a little bit of neutral gray into my German gray. I'm going to start highlighting these areas further. And as you can see, I'm just going to be applying a little bit more sparingly, a little bit more carefully, focusing more on folds and creases. On the back of the backpack, it's not very deep folds, but there's some slight creasing there, so I'm kind of inventing a little bit myself here. I'm sort of making sort of horizontal lines and blending them out a little bit, but that's just to get a little bit more interest in that surface, because it's big and flat, and I want to add, you know, just extra definition beyond what's sculpted. And on the hat, I'm going to start applying these lighter grays sort of towards the top of the hat and then pulling it downwards using vertical lines. And of course the top of the hat you should always paint with the lightest gray shade because you expect there to be a lot of light really hitting there. Now I've mixed even more neutral gray into the German gray, and I'm just going to continue as I was, just adding even higher highlights but keeping it just even more sort of judicious in terms of where I apply the colors. And you can see starting really to focus on edges and seams, and on that back of that backpack I'm still applying clear lines, but I'm really blending them out a lot so they don't get too strong. And I'm going to do the same thing on the hat I did before. I'm going to apply vertical lines all around it and pulling them downwards so they get lighter, but I'm not going to pull them down as far as I did with the sort of last pass, so they just, it's just, and that'll get sort of a gradual gradient effect, but it'll also simulate sort of the way the fabric would be covering that hat. I'm going to make one final mix of gray, which is almost pure neutral gray, and in fact I may have even lightened it further with some white. And I'm going to be applying this now really only to areas that I expect to be sort of shiny leather. So on the boots and stuff, you can see I'm placing it on the heels and the toes, and I'm using it as an edge highlight on his sword scabbard, and on the bill of his hat, which would have been sort of a shinier leather I think than the rest. And you can see also an edge highlight a little bit around the backpack, some extra high kind of streaks across its back. I'm not going to be applying it to the body of the hat itself because I don't want it to get any more shiny than it already is. But this is really just sort of an edge highlight for these areas. And you can go even higher if you want in some places if you really want to emphasize shininess. And then when I finished this, I took a little bit of leather brown and I mixed it into the light gray shade I just made, and I thinned it quite a lot, and then I very lightly used it sort of almost randomly go over some areas of leather where I wanted to simulate some sort of higher wear or give the sense that there's more of that base leather color coming through. So, just pick some areas like his shoes and his heels or toes, or maybe a little on the brim of his hat or the corners of his backpack, and just sort of lightly apply this color. And it'll just give a little bit more interesting depth and tone to a few places. We've taken care of a lot of the major areas of the uniform now, so it's time to start working on finishing off the details. I'm going to work first on his mess bag here, which should be sort of a canvas color. So I'm going to start out by just base coating it with Vallejo buff. Don't forget also to take care of the strap that is going over his shoulder that's attached to the mess bag. As soon as that's dry, I'm going to immediately apply an Agrex Earthshade wash to the mess bag, and while that's drying I'm going to get some other bits done, like his water flask, which was sort of a wood barrel. From what I could see, these were often sort of a dark blue color, that I guess they were painted that way. So I'm going to base coat this flask using a mixture of dark Prussian blue and just black. So it starts out very, very dark indeed. And I'm then also going to paint the strap for the flask using first German camouflage black brown, because the strap seems to be leather on these things most of the time. So then once those sort of areas are base coated, your initial base on the canvas mess bag should be done. So you can go back and start highlighting. And I'm going to start by just taking pure buff again and going back over as my first highlight color, since the Agrex Earthshade wash darkened it so substantially. You can just do that. And then once that is dry, and you probably want to put a couple of layers of it on just to get some more, refined sort of differences in tone, you can then just mix a little bit of white into your buff color to lighten it further, and then just use that sort of as the highest highlight layer on the mess bag. It's pretty obscured in this case, so you shouldn't have to put too much effort into this particular piece of equipment. Next, I'm going to highlight the water flask. First, I'm just going to apply some dark Prussian blue straight up onto the flask. You're not going to see that too much. So then to continue lighting and getting a better highlight, I'm going to use some Luftwaffe uniform World War II, which I'm going to mix into my dark Prussian blue. And I'm going to apply that sort of as a secondary highlight, which will really start defining those staves a lot better, and also that sort of wood grain area in the middle. And then you can just continue lightening that shade with more of the Luftwaffe uniform, or even just using some pure Luftwaffe uniform at the very end, possibly cutting it with a little white just to highlight the edges of those staves. And that's basically all I did on the barrel, because from what I can see in the pictures, you really still want this to stay pretty dark. It shouldn't get really too light, and it should have a different sort of blackish gray cast to it. I also want to quickly highlight the leather strap for the flask, so I'm going to do that first with a pretty much overall coat of Vallejo leather brown, and I'm going to follow that up by very gently just touching the edge, first with some Foundry chestnut shade, and then some Foundry chestnut medium, as I often do when I want to highlight leather. But this strap is so tiny and so fine, you shouldn't really need to apply very much of either of those colors. Now I'm going to start working on all the white braid and strapping, which is a really prominent part of this uniform, but I saved it for last because it's kind of on sort of the highest level of the sculpt, so pretty much everything else is underneath this. And also, a lot of the darker colors I painted earlier might have messed up this white if I had applied the white first. So whenever possible, I recommend you do these sort of white lacing details really when you're nearly done painting the figure. I'm base coating them using just some silver gray, which I have darkened just a little bit with neutral gray because I thought silver gray was maybe a little bit too light by itself as a base coat. And this is really just a question of being careful, taking your time, and making sure you get all of the areas on the figure, but just don't make a mess and get your paint where you don't want it. So that you're going to want to be sure you paint his sort of chest strap. All of the strapping on his backpack's going to be white. The lacing on his facings, various buttons. The top of his plume is also going to be white. Pretty much all the areas on the uniform that we haven't done yet, you're going to want to carefully paint with this base. The next step here is to start highlighting all the white lacing and straps, and I'm just doing that by using thinned down white paint, and I'm going to be applying that sort of gradually in layers and sort of just building it up progressively until I get each area as bright or light as I need it to be. This process is going to be a little bit time consuming just because there's so many white areas and it takes so long really to just build up a good density of white. What you can do if you want to speed this process up a little bit is you can just sort of do this for a little while, and then if you want to get a really bright white finish on sort of key areas, take some really thick white paint that you haven't diluted very much so it'll go on very bright white immediately, and then just use that as sort of a final highlight. But be sure you have built up most of your tone and definition already. The good news is when you're painting straps and things like this, it goes a lot faster. It's a lot easier than, say, painting pants like I did several tutorials ago with my French Legionnaire. That is a lot more time consuming. These areas are so small and so fine, you don't have to put as much effort into creating really varied highlighting on the white areas. You just really want to make sure that you get a little bit of clear variation, and that you leave darker grays down in any seams or recesses, and then you get a really bright white finish on sort of high accent areas like the top of his plume and some of those areas in the top of his backpack straps, the tops of his lacings, things like that. But this doesn't require a lot of blending or anything like that to do. It's just more just being patient and just building up enough white everywhere that you can clearly see that these areas are supposed to be white and not gray. And then next I'm just going to base coat the staff of the Sergeant's Spear here, and I'm just going to be using some leather brown paint for that purpose. And then I'm going to sort of subtly highlight the spear shaft by mixing a bit of beige brown into that leather brown as sort of a first highlight shade. And you can see I'm applying that pretty much everywhere except maybe sort of on the inside of the spear where it is sort of facing towards him. But I'm applying it thinly, blending it out, applying a couple layers. And then I'll go back in again, and this time with some pure beige brown, which I'm thinning a bit, and I'm going to apply that really to the sort of the front surface of the spear, and a lot more gently, as you can see, just to give it a slight brighter highlight where I feel like it needs it. We're almost done now, so it's time to tackle the metal areas. I'm going to start here with the point of the spear, which I'm base coating here as usual using a mixture of German gray and gunmetal as my base. I'm then going to go back in with pure gunmetal and sort of lightly highlight areas where I expect more light to be hitting. When you've got a spear like with two clear faces like this, you want to put a stronger highlight on one side of that spear half and leave it darker on the other side. Now, if this was a gun, I would be stopping here, but because this is a spear, I want it to be extra shiny, so I'm then going to go back in again with some Vallejo Air steel, which I'm going to use to sort of further highlight the spear blade and sort of those points on the side. Now for the sort of brass bronze areas. Now, normally I would be using here a mixture of German camouflage, black brown, and some Vallejo Air gold as my base. But I didn't have any Vallejo Air gold here. I only had bright brass, which I don't like as well because it's, well, more brassy. It's got a sort of a greenish cast, which I don't really appreciate, but I'm just making do here. So I'm going to be applying a base of the bright brass with the German camouflage black brown to the hardware on his scabbard, the plate on the front of his helmet, and the buckle on the front of his sash, along with a few little bits on his water canteen. Depending on your figure, you may have to paint additional metal areas, like if you can see more of his uniform, you might see that he has some silver or metal buttons that you'll need to take care of. I'm then going to highlight these areas of brass using just pure bright brass. Apply quite thinly because I don't want it to get too overwhelming, but you know, just kind of use this as an edge highlight to bring forward those areas that you really want to sort of pop out. Alright, so here's our finished British Napoleonic sergeant from your typical kind of line regiment. Obviously, most of the techniques here would be equally applicable for just normal lower level soldiers because the uniform on the sergeant and your just typical kind of grunts is basically the same. He's just got a few extra signs of his status like the spear and his sash and things like that. I think this figure came out really nicely. I'm quite happy with it. It was, as you would expect from a Napoleonic figure, more work than, you know, your sort of average thing. But, you know, it's again a case of you can see, you know, what good results you can get if you want to put in the time and the effort. Probably if you're painting 32 of these guys, you're not going to want to be doing all of this, but you maybe can learn some things here that'll be nice for sort of diorama or vignette type figures, or, you know, just for some guys that you want in your first rank, for example, that you want to look extra nice. I'm really happy, too, with how these gray pants came out. I think they look real nice, and I think they should be a good alternative for people who are not into painting white pants, because, let's face it, getting a nice, well-shaded pair of white pants really takes a lot more time and effort than these sort of more medium gray ones. So I really recommend these if you're looking to cut some corners on, you know, painting time. And, yeah, so, again, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please let me know what you thought, what you liked, what you didn't like. Leave me comments on this, and, you know, share the video with your friends. Subscribe, please, if you have not already. I, of course, always like to hear what you think, and I really appreciate your support. I will be back in the Netherlands next week for the next video. So hopefully that'll be nice because we'll be working with some better paints and the lighting will be better. I realize it's been a little bit less than optimal for these last two videos, but hopefully it hasn't been too distracting. So that's all for now, and I will see you next time.